In this episode, Jonathan Straus and I discuss Moshe Krakowski's academic article, Developing and Transmitting Religious Identity, Curriculum and Pedagogy in Modern Orthodox Schools. Hope you enjoy the conversation. So Moshe Krakowski, the king of qualitative educational research, which I have my own, issues with. I mean, I don't have an issue with it. It's great. Every qualitative piece of research is great.
Yeah.
Right. The question is I don't know how much it adds to the overall conversation. But this paper was really interesting. Let's start with this. I broke it down kind of the way he does in the abstract, and I think that's a good framing. And then we'll jump into individual pieces. So he identifies a problem, he identifies the root of the problem, and then he presents a solution. So the problem is modern orthodoxy is declining. In other words, participation rates people identify as modern Orthodox is declining. And there's considerable evidence that student disengagement with religious studies classes is part of this decline. So modern Orthodox schools having trouble engaging students in Limudei Kodesh, in religious studies classes, is part of the decline. A root of the student disengagement in religious studies classes, as he sees it, is because schools are failing to provide learning, and here I'm paraphrasing, that engages modern Orthodox teens where they are at. And he says there are two areas where the schools are not engaging them where they're at. Number one, they are pluralistic and autonomous, right? So they have a wide range of what they want to see or want to engage with as acceptable or potentially acceptable. And they are very autonomous, right? They feel like I should do what I want to do and I should have my own thoughts and independently. And I think all of these are probably, as we express them, relative to the yeshiva world or relative to the ultra-Orthodox world. So that's one area where teens are not being met where they're at, is in regard to pluralism and autonomy. And the second area where they are not being met where they're at is that their mindsets are secular. In their frameworks for seeing the world are secular in the sense that they are focused on achieving high marks in their general studies or secular studies classes. Their ambitions are to attend elite either universities or programs within universities. And so their academic orientation through school is really on the secular side of the ledger, right? So you could have a modern Orthodox school that devotes 50% of its time to the Limudei Kodesh and 50% of its time to general studies. But if the cultural milieu of the school is we're going to elite universities and that's where we want to go, general studies is going to end up dominating the conversation, right? Let's say as opposed to the yeshiva world where kids might learn in yeshiva for years afterwards, getting into a good yeshiva, having a good rebbe, all of those things matter. Okay. So that's the problem. That's the root of the problem. The solution, as he sees it, is to design religious studies classes using PBL, project-based or problem-based learning, right? The purpose of this paper was to evaluate a school that was using PBL in their Limudei Kodesh classes. If I had to guess, it was Fuchs Mizrahi in Cleveland, just because he mentions it's not a New York area school, and Fuchs is focused on PBL. So I would guess that, but I could be wrong. And if it is, he's chosen a great school in terms of the educators who run the place. And just to explain PBL for a moment, basically the idea is that students learn through an active process of engaging in a problem-solving exercise or a research project. And so the teacher becomes less of a sage on the stage, lecturing in front of the room, but more of a guide on the side, sort of pushing students in the pursuit of their own project. There's a lot more autonomy in project-based learning because students get to pursue the problems or projects that they want. There's also an expansion because they can kind of take these in individual directions, so there's more of an accommodation towards pluralism. And so there's the connection he's drawing, that by engaging with project-based learning, modern Orthodox students will be able to engage with Limudei Kodesh, engage with religious studies on their own terms.
You asked me to come up with an article at one point in time, and I read this article, I was very excited. And the reason why I was excited, because I think, as you say, there's the first half of the article where he frames the problem, and the second half of the article where he frames the solution.
Right, so we could debate both.
Right. And I think they're two different debates.
Okay, good.
And the reason why I would say I think you're sort of right in terms of your framing of the problem is because you framed it as kind of a technical problem. We have a problem of religious disengagement that's reflected in our education. And as a result, we need to change some of the focus of the education. in order to really engage the students and take into account how to fix this problem. When I read the article, I took a different problem statement from that.
Okay.
Which is that modern Orthodoxy, and he actually analogizes it to Jewish identity, is so ill-defined, it's useless. And students and families are coming from a huge, varied cultural environment that they don't have the same language, they don't have the same interest, they don't have the same desire. And so when you're trying to teach students of such a huge variety, what is it actually you're trying to do? So when we say there's religious disengagement, some families might push back and say there's no religious disengagement. Our kid is perfectly engaged and you guys are doing a great job. And other families will say, hey, this is not modern Orthodoxy. This is not classic modern Orthodoxy. My son, instead of reading Shakespeare, is going to a movie at night. So that's problem number one.
I agree with that. I agree with that framing completely.
Right. And so then the question becomes, what is the common value that everybody organizes around? And he says now, because modern Orthodoxy is so difficult to define, it becomes secular achievement. And that is just the common narrative that everybody in the school can rally around. It's much easier for us all to say we need to be high achievers for whatever reason. And as a result, we're going to gear our education towards this elite high achieving.
So you're doing essentially it's interesting. What you're doing is, as I understand, is you're taking what he takes as a given in the study, and you're saying, hold on, let's not take this as a given. Let's pull it out and examine it for a second, right? As its own thing, right? It doesn't have to be a given that modern Orthodoxy is in this way pluralistic, autonomous, secular focused, right? Because that's not necessarily true for everyone who would identify under the label modern Orthodox. But the problem is there is no clear identity of that label.
Correct.
Okay, let me turn it, because I have a draft of a paper, an essay I wrote that is probably too convoluted to publish anywhere, but it's about like sort of my journey through modern Orthodoxy. And a lot of this, what you just said, dovetails with it. So let me ask you a question. Give me the contrasting or comparing view from the yeshiva world. Both of us have this shared background of having grown up in the yeshiva world. So where does the yeshiva world meet or provide these sort of anchoring common language elements that the modern Orthodox world doesn't?
Right. So he does that actually a little bit in the
article.
A little bit in the paper. And I think the idea is that they socialize you into the fact that doing something hard and boring and is cool and it will pay off eventually.
Right.
And your currency, the way that you're going to be judged as an adult, is entirely dependent on how hard you work right now at this point in time in your life. And we're able to convince kids and students that the effort right now is worth the reward.
Okay. So I want to highlight what he says, and then we can get into it, because he has a great comparison he does here with studies that were done on signature pedagogies, right? Which are basically like, if you're going to be a lawyer or a doctor, you're committed to getting into a field, you realize there's all sorts of language that you need to learn, or details of the profession that might themselves be boring. But because your end goal is, I want to be in this club, I know I need to learn all these things in order to participate in the club. And he cites various studies that show the effectiveness of creating these sort of signature pedagogies. And he says the yeshiva world really does that, right? It creates these signature pedagogies. And he has this great line. I actually want to read from the article because I think it's really good. He says, here I'm going to go. Part of signature pedagogy's strength is the fact that shared experiences allow classroom practices to include features that might otherwise seem boring, difficult, or pointless to students. Precisely because attending a professional school signifies students' commitment to a clear endpoint of participation in a particular community of practice, the foundational skill-building aspects of student activities do not need to resemble actual mature practices in order to hold students' attention. In other words, they want to get there, so they'll go through it. I'm skipping now. This model, however, cannot work within modern Orthodox schools, which neither can nor aim to socialize students in this way. Without such a large cultural superstructure supporting them, and without students' assumptions of a single shared religious future, how can modern Orthodox schools present religious material in a way that resonates with students? That's effectively the question. Okay, so let me tell you my thought. I wonder if yeshivish schools have this element of signature pedagogies. I do believe they do, right? I'm not going to I wouldn't try to argue they don't at all. But let's challenge that for a second. Is it that everyone really wants to learn Daf Yomi? So everyone knows, okay, if I want to learn Daf Yomi, I have to figure out, what the annoying nitty gritty of navigating a daf is like. Is that really bought into the system? Or are there actually larger sort of social communal values, pressures that exist within the yeshiva world that make thinking otherwise off limits, right? I'll give you an example. Like, I would call these like lived values. So like in the yeshiva world, das Torah is a lived value. What do I mean by that? It means that everyone who's gone to yeshiva knows that at some point your questions will get shut down by that's das Torah. There's only a certain amount you can pursue a line of questioning until you run into, you're just being a kofar, right? Or you're pushing beyond the line. And that creates a sort of social conformity. It's like, that's how you have a community that engages in such deep intellectual practice, but yet is so cut off from certain strands of intellectual thought because those are just considered outside. Like, to me, that's a much more powerful force than like a collective sense that I want to be a Daf Yomi learner one day.
I think there's a certain truth to what you're saying. I would push back a little bit because I'm not sure how many students or people actually care about where the lines are that you're going to get shut down when somebody comes to you and says das Torah. Like, am I going to talk about what divine providence is and how free will is reconciled with God's foreknowledge? Some people care, some people don't. It will disturb some people's religious worldview and it won't others. I do think nothing happens in a cultural vacuum. And the cultural container and the world creating that ultra-Orthodoxy does for their students is very, very strong. It's a thick culture. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with das Torah or the idea that at some point in time, conformity is the most important thing. They don't view themselves as conforming. They view themselves as outsiders to general society. And that's what creates their thick culture. And that's what.
So I was going to say the other live value, the first one would be das Torah. The other live value would be the hard wall between general society and us. In other words, as soon as you're moving into general culture, you're out of bounds. So you want to have a TV, you want to go to movies, that's fine. But that's never going to be something you talk about loudly, right? Or you engage, like you could go to a movie, but don't make it part of your Shabbos drasha. Whereas you're in a modern Orthodox shul, you should totally make movies part of your Shabbos drasha.
I mean, you don't even need to go to movies.
Right.
You can say, when I'm studying science, what am I doing? Am
Right.
I doing something that has inherent religious value that will enrich my life religiously?
Right.
Or am I doing something that's pragmatic that will get me a job as I move through life? And, speaking crudely, boys, let's say within the yeshivish world, have two outcomes. They could be a full-time learner or they could be a learner-earner. And both of them are good.
Yeah.
Right.
So let's go back to my question. So I would say let's say if you want to weigh that one over das Torah, great. Those two lived values, right? Just not values that people necessarily articulate in the abstract, but they just live them. Those two lived values, to me, are much stronger than the pedagogical approach. The success of Limudei Kodesh programs is in the yeshiva world is not driven by a different pedagogy, by some sense of I want to be a future learner, or I want to have these skills for learning in the future. It's just driven by a sense of their boundaries here of this community. And if you want to be in it, you've got to abide by what we want you to be in, right?
Well, I mean, it filters down to pedagogy because it filters down, as you always talk to me about, if you're going to make a resource-based budget and you're going to do a time allocation of what's important to you, the most important thing is Gemara. You're going to pay Rebbeim the most. They're going to be around the school the most. You're going to make sure that the kids are spending the most amount of time on Gemara study as opposed to anything else, to the exclusion of secular studies, to the exclusion of general studies, right?
Why is that, though? Why is that the yeshiva world can get away with? In other words, let's say I want to start a modern Orthodox, Hillel Rapp Modern Orthodox Academy tomorrow, and I want to say, our entire focus of our education is going to be Gemara. We are going to start in grade 5, just like the yeshiva world. We're going to drill on Gemara skills. We're going to do the whole thing exactly the same way. Why would that not fly in a modern Orthodox school?
I don't know that it wouldn't, number one.
Okay, great.
Number two is, let's say that it wouldn't. I mean, I know the constraints that our school, our joint school in Toronto is operating under. We have to teach Ivrit. There's this perception that you need to know Navi, you need to know Halacha, you need to know Chumash, as opposed to I'm going to do Gemara and I'm going to do Shnai Mikra and I'm going to do some sort of Musar Seder when the Rosh Yeshiva talks to me for an hour, and then that's fine, right? We're trying to give a holistic...
So I have a different take on it, because halavai, your answer should be right. Right? Like halavai, it should be the case that modern Orthodox schools want a broader range of skills. And so students are actually being trained on Tanakh decoding in addition to Gemara, and they're all fluent Hebrew speakers and readers. And so, you know, we're maybe not doing everything as intensely, but we're doing everything at a quality level. My estimation is we're doing nothing at a quality level, right? And the reason we're doing nothing at a quality level is because the real answer to the question of why you can't do that in a modern Orthodox school is because modern Orthodox parents don't want their children to be burdened with what it takes to learn at a high level.
I think if you took the same amount of hours that you're spending on everything and just focused it on Gemara, the kids would be better at Gemara. Right? Do you disagree?
Yes. No, I agree 100%. But you could do the same thing. You could focus everything on Ivrit and actually do a real Ivrit immersion program, and kids could be great at Ivrit. I mean, it did happen, right? Like the old Flatbush and Ramaz of 50 years ago actually produced Hebrew speakers, right? And there may have been trade-offs in that, but it worked. Like there were Ivrit programs that produced better Hebrew speakers than we have today.
Right.
So that could work. But again, I think the reason we don't do it is because communally, let me put it this way. A modern Orthodox parent doesn't want their child, and I use this broadly, obviously not everyone's the same as we discussed, but let's say you can imagine a modern Orthodox parent doesn't want their child to come home and be upset because they had a really hard test in Gemara and they failed and they're crying. And their entire relationship with Judaism, as you see it, is through this mean teacher who's making you memorize 100 vocabulary words, and you can't memorize those things. And then you get the phone call, and I'm not saying this hypothetically, these are real phone calls.
Right.
Why are you doing this to my child? Why is all of their, connection with Judaism being defined by tests and skills and all of that stuff?
You're layering or you're projecting a modern Orthodox education on a Haredi worldview or society. I don't know if they have tests. I don't know if they care about the test marks. That also is part of it, right? When his argument, Krakowski's argument, is that the culture around it lends its importance to it. And I think what he's saying about modern Orthodoxy is there's no strong culture around a single value that you can then use to assess, push, create religious growth. Now here, one of the things that I thought of initially, and we can get spicy on your podcast, is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Thinking about our school, and I would push back, I think we do a decent enough job, and I know I have to say this on the president, we do a decent enough job of giving kids some content knowledge and skill base. Like they get into, if our measure is what yeshivas they get into, or what seminaries they get into the ones they need to get into.
Okay, I could quibble with that, but let's leave it for now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where is the shared value in our school? Where's the narrative builder? I would argue that that's the state of Israel. It's the religious Zionist component. And we do a very good job about acculturating students into religious Zionism. And our feeder school also does a very good job of bringing our kids into the world of religious Zionism. By religious Zionism, I will just loosely define it as love of Israel.
Okay, sure.
That's it.
Sure.
Right?
Okay.
They love Israel.
Right.
They might not know what it is.
Right.
They might not know how complex it is.
Right. But they love it.
Right.
They
love it. And
Great.
they feel an emotional attachment to it. And that emotional attachment can be interpreted as a religious attachment. And then we can say, we found the one thing that everybody in our community agrees on. In the ultra-Orthodox schools, it's what does a good yeshiva boy look like? Or what does a good Beis Yaakov girl look like? And there's a very thick culture, as I said, that defines it.
Yeah.
In our school, we don't know what a good boy is. A good boy can be, or a good girl can be, somebody who's learning, or somebody who's trying to learn, and somebody's getting good marks, or somebody's doing a lot of chesed, right? We don't have the ability to kind of create a single unifying story that everybody can buy into, parents included, other than attitudes towards Israel.
I think that's true. And the reason I think it's true is because in the same way a child in the yeshiva world who wanted to look, act differently would have a very hard time, I think students in our school who have the inclination to sort of challenge the predominant narrative on Israel have a really hard time. So I think that is a good comparison. Here's where my head goes, though. First of all, to the first point you made of does the yeshiva world test and push these things? I think it does. And I think when you look at high school, especially the later years of high school and base medrash, you're actually looking at the product of a very skill-intensive education in the early years, right? So if you think about what happens in primary school in the yeshiva world, you certainly have tests, and you certainly have kind of the old school heavy notion of memorizing shorashim, being able to taicha Gemara, and that culminates with your bechina, right, for your faher, for Mesifta, where you have to be able to open up, in order to get into high school, you have to be able to open up a Gemara and read a page of Gemara. And I don't think you get there without there being heavy skill training. I think once you are so engrossed in Gemara learning, the actual skills become secondhand, and now you're dealing with higher order thinking development and things like that, where they move farther away from testing and assessment and more into just sort of developing those skills at the different levels that students are at based on who their chavrusa is, who their shir is, and so on. So I do think the skills are there, whereas in the modern Orthodox world, I don't think we do that. At least in the experience I had with my own children, I think we are moving further and further away from heavy skill building. I think there was a time where Ivrit was that so the way Israel is the substitute for the socializing piece of the yeshiva world, I think there was a time where Ivrit was really, in a classic modern Orthodox school, that was the thing they took seriously. So you might not know how to learn Gemara, but you'll probably be able to carry on a conversation in Hebrew. I think we've bailed on that commitment. So I don't think we do it in general. To the other point, I think you're right in that sense. I guess my question would be, do you think that, is it good? Is Israel the right thing for us to have as sort of our defining feature? Is that ideal?
Well, I mean, that depends who you ask, and that depends how much of a difficult conversation you want to have. That's just the way it is right now. I think it's easier. It's easier than trying to take a whole bunch of, let's say, 5 different microcultures and create a narrative of love of God, love of Torah, love of learning, even just for the sake of learning, if that is not something that's going to be consistently reinforced in every single other cultural environment that these students are coming from. Mm-hmm. Whereas in the yeshiva world, it is reinforced, right? All the other elements, learning is reinforced, right? Being koveya eating the Torah, right? Just even though I've had a hard day at work, I'm going to pick up a book at night or a podcast or a Torah tape or whatever I have, and I'm going to put that as part of my day and focus on it and talk about it, right? That becomes a conversation. That becomes what you look at when you're evaluating families for shidduchim, right? In a modern Orthodox society, as I was told many times with, again, bringing it back to our schools, that we really, especially in a city like Toronto, we have 5 different schools in one. So it becomes very difficult to be all things to all people. And I just think the default is the easiest. And you see you're having success there, so you just double down on that, right?
To what extent is what you're describing putting the cart before the horse, right? Meaning, maybe that's not the best phrase, but to what extent is this a lack of leadership? I think there are 2 models you can look at. One model is, this is the community we serve. How do we serve the community we have, right? This is where their priorities are. We're not going to change their priorities. We're not going to shape their priorities. We are a customer service organization, and we are going to serve the customers where they're at. Versus saying, we're a mission-driven school. This is our mission, right? And we're going to be about this. And if you don't come from a cultural background that puts you in this mission, doesn't mean you can't participate. But when you're participating in this mission. I think the yeshiva world has more of that, meaning I don't think you don't actually have microcultures in the yeshiva world, right? Like you and I probably grew up in more moderate yeshiva environments. So there are microcultures in the yeshiva world too. But the yeshiva world has a lot of leadership, meaning the Rosh Yeshiva who starts the yeshiva says, this is what we're going to be about. And then, if you want in on that yeshiva, even if you are coming from a home that has a particular microculture, you have to conform to that. It seems to me in the modern Orthodox world, we don't do that. We're much more oriented like a customer service business, right? Where it's, we have to recruit from this clientele. And in order to recruit from this clientele, we have to shape ourselves to what they want us to be. And if parents call up and complain, our answer can't be, no, this is what we're about. Like, we're going to be heavily focused on Gemara. You want to be a part of this, this is what it's going to be about.
Well, I think it's because, going back to his point, which is that the modern Orthodox identity is so diffuse, it's meaningless. So the reason why you can be customer focused or you could be hyper responsive to parental feedback and complaint is because the parent body could say legitimately that they are very good modern Orthodox Jews. And as a result, you pushing back at my complaint is a judgment on my religious values and worldview. And I don't know if people are willing to do that. Like, that is a very high cost. Not only is it a high cost, I don't know if we can legitimately say that they're wrong.
That felt like the most Toronto response ever.
Really? You know, I'm not even from Toronto.
I know. But you know why it felt like a Toronto response? Because you put the goal of the school in this sort of hashkafic lens, right? In this hashkafic box. If you want to welcome a parent into your school, they have to say, I'm modern Orthodox, right? Like,
no, not at all. Not at all.
Okay. So what do you mean then?
I think they say I'm modern Orthodox,
right?
But they don't know what it means.
Okay.
The same thing is I can say I'm religious Zionist. I don't know what that means. I could teach you religious Zionism. I could teach you religious Zionism 100 different ways with a completely different worldviews.
But again, that's true in the yeshiva world too. Meaning, I could say I'm yeshivish, but in the end, I have a TV in my home, and I do all these other things, and I have, I have a real profession, and I want my kids to go to university, but I'm going to send them to the super yeshivish school, even though I know that's not my hashkafa.
No, but we have a fundamental organizing value that we can talk through, which is I want my kids to be really good at learning Gemara, or I want my kids to be Bnei Torah, however you want to define that, even though that's also amorphous.
But right, I think you're getting to the same.
No, I'm not flattening it, and I think the idea is that Gemara-focused curriculums have a singular focus. That means you just have to be good at Gemara. For girls, you just have to be good at Chumash, or you just have to be good at whatever it is you want to be at. We've created, for whatever reason, a society whereby there's multiple layers and meanings of success. There are multiple ways to express that level of success, and then we're saying, okay, we'll meet that. Okay. Now, I agree with you that we shouldn't be.
Okay, hold on. I got a few different directions I want to go in here. Okay. First of all, let's pause for a second on just that piece of Gemara, because what about girls? Right? What is the yeshiva? What about girls? What is the yeshivish? What is the yeshiva? Everything you described works in terms of Gemara focus for boys. What's the alternative focus for girls' education?
So he's very gendered here also. But that's, I think, also why girls' schools historically have better secular programs than the boys' schools. Because there's an understanding, especially within a specific subset of Haredi society, that the women are going to have to be the higher income earners within the relationship. Right. Also, they have more time to spend on general studies because they have less time to spend on Gemara. And they're expected to help out at the home and develop into this whole self.
Right. There's definitely a more of a hashkafic focus, a performative focus, right? So Beis Yaakov's a lot of
I don't know if it's
performances. Right. But meaning I'm saying like putting on plays, right? Like that sort of like I will perform Judaism in a certain way. I will actually even embody roles in a large school performance of kind of these traditional maternal, female Jewish roles. Okay, fine. So same idea. Whereas in modern Orthodox schools, we at least in theory create sort of a parity, right? Like we're not looking to educate our girls substantially differently than our boys, although in our school that is the case that we are. But that's probably more of like the amorphous place we exist in between the yeshiva world, let's say, and what you might call the co-ed modern Orthodox world of New York, right? Like your Frisches and Ramazes and that world. Okay. So now back to the question. So in your view, right, could the modern Orthodox world do the same thing, right? So the yeshiva world says Gemara is our focus. And so because we are singularly focused, that is our kind of entire curriculum, right? If the yeshiva world is focused entirely on Gemara, right? Like that's their sine qua non. Could the modern Orthodox world say, okay, we're focused entirely on Ivrit. We're focused entirely on Tanakh. Like what stops us from doing that? And the reason let me see where I'm going with this is, to me, the customer service model stops us from doing that. Meaning at the end of the day, we can't even say that we're about something because we're so beholden to our customers.
Maybe. I mean, I would say you're right. There's literally nothing that is stopping us from saying that if we wanted to focus on Tanakh, we would just focus on Tanakh. Just pour all your resources into Tanakh education. I think one of the challenges is that religious literacy is essentially defined around Gemara. You will be a religious illiterate if you have zero capability of opening up a Gemara and learning how to read. You will not know how the halachic process works. It will be completely closed off to you. So I would argue that to be a religiously engaged and informed Jew, you need to have some facility with Gemara. You don't need to love it. You don't need to learn it for the rest of your life, right? But you need to know how to do it. That's like a bottom line. That's my perspective specifically. Now, when I look at kind of a school environment, I think that you are right. You're trying to be all things to all people, in which case you're allocating resources to Tanakh, to Gemara, to Halacha, to Jewish philosophy, even to modern Middle East, so religious Zionism, right? In which case, you're just diffusing the amount of time you have during the day, right? You just don't have enough time to get really good at anything. Mm-hmm. Now, that is a value decision that you're making, right? And this is one of the things that we talked about before, is how do you make a values-based budget? So which is why I think his diagnosis or his problem-based learning is actually probably still the right diagnosis, even though I might quibble with the problem statement, right? But in terms of, can we envision a different way of organizing the school, a different way of organizing the school day? I would say 100% yes. But the reason why we don't, and the reason why we've fallen into the trap that we have, is still, I think, pointed out to him, which is that if our goal can't be defined religiously, then let's define our goal according to the general studies values, which is let's have a really good general studies education. And then I'm going to organize my day in such a way that maximizes that as well. I'm going to have my periods. I'm going to offer more class choice.
I agree with that, except the only twist I would put on it is I don't think it's like, I think that the driving force of the stereotypical modern Orthodox parent or the customer or the point of least resistance between satisfying your broadest range of possible customers is to say we are not going to be about any sort of heavy skill building in any particular Judaic studies area, be it Gemara, Tanakh, Ivrit, right? We are going to be about some sort of very broad, connective, something to engage you. Engagement, right? He keeps coming back to that in the article also, this idea of engagement, right? I want my Limudei Kodesh program to engage you Jewishly. And a successful Judaic studies class is a class that engages you, right? It doesn't necessarily give you certain skills that you're going to carry with you for your life to be engaged in learning in a lifelong sense, but they'll be awesome classes. They'll be like, that teacher was great. That project I did was amazing. And he's 100% right. Project-based learning is one of the better methodologies to create student engagement, right? Because it embodies autonomy and all these other things that are known to engage students, right? It's a great book I have behind you called In Search of Deeper Learning. And it's these two researchers, Sarah Fine and Jal Mehta, if I remember their names, who essentially go about trying to look at alternative schools in the United States to find out which model does it best. And they basically examine no excuses schools, international baccalaureate schools, and project-based learning schools. And what they realize in the course of their research is that no schools are doing it right, but individual teachers engaged in a community of practice around these methodologies are doing it really well. And their book actually shifts from examining the schools to just examining the teachers. And the book ends up concluding with a series of sort of, common traits that teachers have that make them really successful. And in all the methodologies, one of the traits is giving students autonomy in their learning, and giving them a sense that they're choosing what they're pursuing and understanding, and that creates high levels of engagement. So he's 100% right about that. I would also quibble whether the intensity of a project-based learning focus is the right thing, as opposed to just really good teachers who do all sorts of things, including project-based learning, but all sorts of different methodologies that engage students. But the goal is still just engagement as opposed to skill building. And I think that's where I get frustrated as a parent, right? Where I grew up in the yeshiva world and gained certain skills that to this day are useful for me as a practicing Jew engaged intellectually with Judaism. And my children aren't getting those skills.
Right.
And that's frustrating for me. And I think I don't, my question would be, is what would be the downside as a modern Orthodox school of saying, no, we're about building skills and we're just going to do this. We're going to make this our focus, and it's going to be painful and it's not going to be easy, but it's going to be what we do because our goal is to for students to have these skills.
Well, I think we're judged a lot on religious engagement. And again, religious engagement is meaningless. It's a meaningless metric. We're judged on how happy the kids are in school. That's also, it's nice for kids to be happy in school. It's really positive, but that doesn't mean they're learning anything.
Right.
You would ideally like to have both. Now, let me ask a question about skills. I had zero skills.
Right.
I grew up in a small town. I had some Hebrew language skills. I got all my skills post-high school yeshiva. And I just sat there over Gemara with a dictionary translating. Yeah. Same thing as my Hebrew language skills. I was living in Israel. I made an effort to talk to cab drivers. I made efforts to do my business in Hebrew. Mm-hmm. I read academic articles in Hebrew. And at the beginning, it was very painstaking. I sat there with a dictionary, not with Google Translate, not with a big picture so I would see everything, but word by word by word by word. And I did 10 pages a day because I wanted to build my vocabulary and build my facility. Now, that's really boring, and it's a real grind. Right now, it paid off. I can read it. So when I sit there and I say, oh, my kids they don't have the same skill set as me, I'm actually not so worried about it. The kids will figure it out if it's important to them. Now, the question is it important to them? Am I modeling the fact that it's important to them? If you say that your son doesn't have the right skill set,
good question.
Are you sitting there at night,
that's a good question,
learning with your son, showing him that, hey, it's really important that you're able to sit here and open this text and read it to me in the way that I can read it to you?
Yeah, I try.
Yeah, and what does he do?
He's not interested.
He's not interested, right? So if your own kids, you are a highly educated, expert educator, right? We'll call you one of the top educators in the Jewish community or in the entire city of Toronto.
Wow, thank you.
And it's hard to get your kid to sit there and want to learn with you.
Right.
Right? Do you think it's easier for the school to be able to get that kid to sit there and learn with them in a way that it could be then reinforced outside of school?
No, but I think it's easier for me if the school is prioritizing that. Meaning if the school is creating a culture whereby learning and learning at home is rewarded and is part of the expectation and is something that's talked about over and over and over again, then that makes my job easier. And that comes from a place where skill building, and in my son's case, would be repetition of psukim over and over and over again, such that they're decoded into Vayomer, and he said, not the modern Orthodox way of reading a whole pasuk and translating it in some mishkabab way, right, as opposed to actually going through the words of the psukim. It's the entire yeshivish way of teaching Chumash is skill-based. The modern Orthodox way of teaching Chumash is not skill-based, right? It's context-based. It's let's know what the psukim say, right, as opposed to let's understand how to actually decode them. At least that's been my experience, right? I can't say that's true for every modern Orthodox school. I think that the culture is there, and I think what stops us is what you hit on, which is student happiness. I think that at some point, a kid who struggles in a yeshiva elementary school is struggling, and if he has a good Rebbe, his Rebbe loves him and he's with him and he's giving him good feeling. But there's no question that the school should change what it's doing because there's a kid who's struggling. I think we get that pushback in modern Orthodox schools. Like, why is my kid unhappy, right? Why does my kid have to struggle? Like they should be. I mean, Minette Mayberg wrote this whole article. I did a podcast on it early on with Yosef about how there should be no tests in Limudei Kodesh, and the biggest problem modern Orthodox schools have is they're treating Limudei Kodesh like general studies, and it's creating all these negative impressions for kids where they feel like it's just another subject with testing. Whether testing is the best form of evaluation or not, at some point, if you are not building and evaluating toward the acquisition of certain skills, then you are not giving kids the independent tools they need to succeed. My child's ability to decide what he's interested in pursuing intellectually is infinitely increased when he is given a solid foundation of 3 skills: Hebrew language, Tanakh textual decoding, and navigating a page of Gemara. In other words, understanding what's going on a page of Gemara, right? If he has those 3 skills, he now has doors open to him to decide that he may or may not want to pursue. But if he doesn't have those skills, meaning if his Hebrew language skills are weak, literally half the Jewish world, if not more, is completely shut off to him, right? So culturally, he's locked out of Israel to a certain extent, and certainly intellectually, in terms of where the most exciting and interesting scholarship is happening in the Jewish world and all of that stuff, he's closed off to. So the door's just not open to him. So I think for me, the basis would be I want a skill foundation that maximizes the potential open doors.
I mean, but you might be working at cross purposes then, because I would argue that the skill foundation for Hebrew language acquisition has nothing to do with Gemara, right? It just detracts from the time available for Gemara study. You have kids who are amazing Gemara learners who can pick up any Gemara, any Rishon, any Achron, any commentator, and they can just rip through it. They don't know any Hebrew at all. They've never even had any Hebrew lessons.
Right. Although I wonder, it's true. Although I wonder if, if you take those kids and move them to Israel, they are probably at a certain advantage. I mean, just from reading Rishonim, they're, if they can really rip through Rishonim, they're at a certain advantage linguistically to someone who has no background.
So what is this? Is the skill set self-sufficiency in learning,
right?
Which is a different skill than Hebrew language, right? And it will have different pedagogical approaches, as far as I know, than just second language acquisition, right?
Right.
And fine, let's focus on that. And let's drop Ivrit as a requirement. And let's just make sure that our kids know how to decode it. Now, I think you still have this pushback, which I've heard, which is that you'll have students who will know how to open a Gemara, but will never want to open a Gemara. And what would you rather have?
That's a David Beshefkin pushback.
Right?
Right. So like David Beshefkin has this podcast he did with Ephraim Goldberg, I don't know, way back when, right? I've quoted it twice in articles I've written.
I was told that when I was choosing high schools for my son.
Right.
So it was pre-Beshefkin.
Yeah, but I mean, that's the argument, right? His argument is that today, and I think he's right about this to a certain extent, today we have more broad-based, excited engagement of teenagers with Yiddishkeit, right, than we did 30 years ago, right? Even though the teenagers of 30 years ago probably had better basic Jewish learning skills than the teenagers today. And he sees that as like an intentional trade-off that made sense, right? Like we just didn't have a sticky product. We had these batty old teachers who were drilling you on skills, and people may have known how to learn, but they had no desire to do it. And now the skills are down, but everyone loves a good Farbrengen, right? Everyone loves to sing and dance and do all these things. And I think that's a mistake. Like I understand where that instinct came from. And I think, that gets back to my netiya in education. I think that's partly because we insist on this model where we don't allow students to master their learning. So we insist on promoting students based on their age, regardless of where they stand. So the child who can, who let's say can earn an A in whatever the skill level of Tanakh education they're in that year, and the child who earns a C still get promoted on to the next skill level at the same time. That's just a pedagogical mistake.
You don't have to do that.
You don't have to do
Judaic
that.
Studies.
Why
do we do that?
Correct. So that to me is actually, that's why I think Beshefkin is not wrong, but I think it's a wrong way to look at it, because because I think that what we did was we said, oh, skills aren't working, so let's just shift to all this warmth and feeling, and ixay on the skills, it's all right, we'll figure it out. I think that the mistake is there we didn't identify the problem, and the problem is that we weren't allowing kids to master their skills. So anything that only works for 20% of students is not going to be successful. So let's create a model where actually 100% of students can build skills, where we can actually have a basis where 98% of students who graduate at X level, high school, we can say they have these skills, right? And whatever those are. And that doesn't mean there can't be a student who has skills in excess of that, but there's a base level. I would still put my 3, right? Conversant and in Hebrew language and writing, right? Not writing Hebrew poetry, not reading the most complex Hebrew writing, but basically conversant in Hebrew language and writing, being able to navigate a page of Gemara and being able to decode Psukim and Tanakh, right? I think you could get that. But you'd have to take it really seriously. You would have to have a program that starts, in grade 1 and goes through grade 12 that is consistently focused on scaffolding and building those skills. And like you said, there's no reason that everyone has to progress at exactly the same rate, because there's no university requirement at the end. There's nothing that everyone has to matriculate to. You can have students progressing at different levels and within different groups. You just have to design your school to accommodate that.
Right. So why does that seem so hard? In my mind, Judaic studies, and this, I guess, is the second half of the question, Judaic studies seems to be the most malleable way to experiment and understand how schools function, right? You're working on designing new classrooms, new pedagogical methods. Why not introduce them within the Judaic studies environment? When I was reading this problem-based learning, some of his examples were tzniut, whether Starbucks is kosher, architecture of a synagogue, right? This touches all sorts of disciplines. It's cross-disciplinary. It's self-directed, so there's a level of engagement and buy-in that's more. And the truth is, these are very important religious skills that a student needs to have, right? Or an engaged Jew needs to have. I need to come up with a problem statement. I need to understand how to research it. And I need to understand how to come to a conclusion that is personally resonant with my own sense of values. Right. That seems to me should be the goal of the Judaic studies curriculum, is how do we get students to actually care? And then once they care, once they've determined what their own values are, how do they express their values within a Jewish lived environment?
Okay, so I have 2 answers I want to give to that question. One is based on practically what I think the obstacle is. And the second is, if you would want to do it, where I think the structure of schools creates problems. So firstly, practically, I think we go back to what I was saying before, which is I am not sure the will to imagine what your child could achieve Jewishly, right, in terms of Jewish knowledge and skill, is there among the parent body in the modern Orthodox world, the general parent body in the modern Orthodox world. Connected to that, I think the leadership that can articulate a vision of what your child could achieve in terms of skills in academic learning, right, is not there. Because we have this customer service mentality, right? So our instinct as leadership is, what do our customers want? How do we create the best recruiting environment for those customers? And the customers don't have this imagination because, like you said, they're just coming from different backgrounds. Let's say everyone's coming from different, microcultures was a great word to use. Everyone coming from different microcultures, so it's, we don't have that sort of collective imagination, and there's no articulated leader who's saying this is what's going to happen, right? So that's one. The second issue is, I think within schools, it actually is difficult to do this because I'm skeptical. This goes back to the book I was just mentioning. I'm skeptical that schools can do anything, right? Meaning, at the end of the day, the biggest mistake we make in education is we invest all this money in school leadership who have these great ideas and these great models and build incredible curriculum, let's say, right? And then they try and put them into a classroom with a teacher who's underpaid and underskilled and isn't particularly effective at managing that classroom. We would be far better off getting rid of all the administrators, hiring really well-paid teachers who are super creative and have a general sense of the goal, and letting them do all this creative stuff. So this idea of we have to be a school that embraces project-based learning, that looks amazing when you have an open house and you say, our philosophy is project-based learning and every teacher is implementing it in this exact way. But the problem is you're going back to the same industrialized model of education that creates these problems where you have every student, matriculating at the same age. In the end, education is science and art, right? Great educators who have the right goals. Like my goal is that every single student has to learn X. And until every single student can demonstrate X through this sort of structure of measure, I haven't succeeded. And if you set up that framework and you put a really talented person into that situation, they will figure out various different methodologies to help get the student there, right? And that to me is the adjustments. But that I think is part of the problem is you can't, like, this idea of a very top-down structure. Like I'm any teacher at Bnei Akiva Schools could tell you that I used to say when I was principal that every teacher is an entrepreneur of their own space, right? But I fundamentally believe that. Like I believe if you want good education, you need to put really talented people in a space with a clear goal, a measured goal that they're accountable to, right? And then allow them to be creative in that space to get to that goal.
And you don't think that that's happening anywhere at scale?
At scale, no. But scale in education is a tricky thing, right? Like there's a number of studies. So I years ago, I became a devoted reader of Ted Sizer, who was the head of Harvard's education grad school for many years. He started a number of sort of alternative schools in the Boston area. He's really interesting. He developed this idea. I mean, he first developed in the 1980s that high school teachers should be coaches of learning, right? Where instead of being an instructor of learning, where I come in for this period of time to instruct you and whatever you get, I'm actually a coach of your ongoing growth and learning. He talks about, and he cites a whole bunch of research on this, that once schools go above, I think it's 300 students, it's basically diminishing returns. Mm-hmm. That this idea of large schools in a industrial model, yes, a larger school can provide more because it can provide more options of classes if you're insistent on the industrial model. But if you're actually focused on the quality of learning, meaning what structure enables the greatest percentage of students to advance from A to B, B to C in sort of measurable learning goals, the smaller is better. Because you need that sort of interactive, responsive relationship between the learner and the teacher or the coach, right? Where, this pathway is running into a dead end, so we have to try and go around this way, right? Or we keep running into this dead end, and so we have to have a conversation. Do you want to keep pursuing this particular content area, or do you want to try a different content area, right? You can't, that's where the power of school is, right? Where a student really becomes self-aware of what they're good at and what they're not good at. And that just, as you get to these large industrial models, you really can't do that in an effective way. So the smaller you make school with the more intense focus, the less you have structured bells and periods, the more you're going to get that type of quality learning. I think that's doable. I just think it's a matter of the imagination and will to do it.
Yeah, I also think it's doable, but I don't see the lack of will to do that, really. And I don't see what the community wants as really an impediment to it. Like, I'm not going to just throw my hands up and say, oh, well, I guess this is the community we live in, and so therefore we can't teach values and we can't try to be community leaders within the school environment. Like I'm the president of a religious school. Religious schools are supposed to be ways that you socialize and teach values to teenagers, at least in our school, mm-hmm. right? And so as a result, we have to figure out what are the values that we're trying to teach. How are we going to impart those values? And what's the best and most effective way of doing that?
We should hire a really expensive consultants to come in and survey the student body and the parent body, and then create a whole vision of what it is. I mean, you're not wrong, right? Like, this as well as I do. Like, this is the exercise, and there's a whole cottage industry of third-party consultants who will come in and do this for you. But how many times have you seen that actually translate into on-the-ground change in a school? And I'm not saying this to be defeatist, right? I'm saying this to set up a problem that I want to tackle, right? Like how many times does that sort of approach actually change things?
Bringing in a consultant?
Yeah.
No, consultants are people who borrow your watch to tell you what time it is.
Exactly.
That's exactly. Usually you bring in consultants for cover so you can fire a lot of people and not get into trouble.
Okay, good. So we're on the same page.
Yeah. I don't think you need a consultant to tell you that. I think sometimes you need consultants because other organizations that are accrediting bodies tell you to get consultants. And so you get consultants. And sometimes it's great to bring in consultants because they have ideas that you haven't heard of, or they can frame things, or they can do the work that nobody else has the bandwidth to do, which is actually survey the parent body or to get a temperature check on some of the concepts that you might be thinking about unrolling. But I think the talent, or at least the vision, is there.
Isn't it doomed? This is what I see happening all the time. The process is doomed from the start because of the very thing we started with, which is you have all these microcultures and you have some parents who are going to look at, hey, what am I getting in the school? It's amazing what I'm getting. My kid is so happy. My kid is wrapped in an Israeli flag and saying Hallel and Yom Ha'atzmaut. Everything's amazing, right? And so I think it's great. And the next parent is going to be like me and be like, my kid's not learning anything. He has no skills.
Right.
It's terrible, right? So you hire your consultants. They do the stakeholder thing. Let's find out what all the stakeholders have to say, and then they get this conglomeration of these microcultures and these stakeholders, and then you weave this into some sort of super broad narrative that actually isn't focused. Like I would much rather, honestly, save the money on the consultant. Say we're about this.
Well, so
and just be about it.
Right.
And by the way, even if the answer to the question is, we're about happiness and we just want kids to come and to be happy and have happy engagement with Judaism. And that's what we're about. And so then stop banging on about skills. We're not about that, right? We're about happiness.
Right.
But just be about one thing.
No, so I think, first of all, for all the consultants that listen, I think Hillel still likes you, and he might still refer you to jobs. But
nope.
Yeah. I think that is one of the things that specifically modern Orthodox schools, and again, like obviously the particular here is very cogent and very top of mind, but there is truth to the particular is universal, and this is kind of what I've seen, which is that you can't necessarily be responsive to feedback or parental feedback to a certain extent, because we're from such a broad-ranging community. And I had parent feedback last week, and I asked them to think upon a problem. And I told them, when you're thinking about this from a problem perspective and you're trying to come up with a solution, just remember that I literally had a call with another parent the day before that said the exact opposite.
Right.
That does not perceive this to be a problem. And your solution to the problem is actually their problem.
Right.
So you have to keep that in mind, and you understand. But that's why, and I think that's your diagnosis is right. Your prescription, I should say, is right, which is that you need to clearly define who you are. You need to clearly define your values, clearly define what you want and hope to accomplish, and be leaders from that perspective, and then say, from a pluralistic perspective, everybody is welcome. But this is what you're going to get.
Right.
This is what we're going to teach.
Right.
And if you don't like it, okay, we're really sorry, but we're going to get really good at doing what we tell you we're going to do.
So who gets to decide that?
Great question.
Right. So this is where if you and I were starting a school tomorrow, we could do it. We could say we're about this, and that would, maybe last until we died, and then, it would become a regular school. But like you have an existing institution, right? Who gets to get up and decide this is what we're about?
Right. So that's the $1 million question. Now, I think schools are somewhat different, because schools are supposed to be representative of values. They're kind of like a shul.
Right.
And so you have a closely held group of people who are going to determine the long-term trajectory of the values. And I hate to say, but that is going to be the head of school, the Rosh Yeshiva, some members of the board, and donors.
Right.
Because we're in a donor-led world, and the donors are also going to be driving what the hashkafa or what the value set of the school is going to be. Now, I think we are actually blessed with some donors who are very hands-off, and I think we're doing what they're saying.
Is that a blessing?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I think to a certain extent, because I think one of the worst things that donors can do is tell you how to run a school. Like, I'm the president of a board. I don't know how to run a school.
I agree with you.
I'm not going to tell you.
I agree with you 100% on the day-to-day basis. But I think based on what we're saying, the best thing, not just donors, but donors, Rosh Yeshiva, board, whoever this group is, the best thing you can actually have I would argue, is a group that is tasked with defining the mission of the school, not on a day-to-day basis, on a monthly basis, based on which parents are complaining to them at Kiddush and Shul, but that there's vision and mission of the school. And it's not in the hands of all the stakeholders. And it's not a consultant job. It is in the hands of a selected and elite few who decide the mission, determine the mission, and the answer to everyone who's not happy with it is, we're determining the mission.
Well,
this
I think
is what we do.
I think you need to have a discipline also with donors where you have to have the ability to say no, right? Which is if a donor says, I want this program to run, and I think this is a great program for the school, if it doesn't line up within the regular day-to-day flow of the school, as you said, or if it's off value, even if it's a parallel value, you just have to say no.
Right. And you can, to me, a good committee, value committee, right? A values-based board, values-based budgeting. If boards aren't just fiduciary vehicles, which is important. I think we had this like post-Madoff reality where like every single Jewish organization, this was the case in New York at least, every single Jewish organizational board suddenly woke up to the fact that they had fiduciary responsibility and they had huge liability if they were in a bad situation, right? And so, there was a big reform movement within boards and governance and being careful about how money flows through institutions and the checks and balances you have. And those are all great. But those essentially became the sole focuses of boards. And then when values questions come up, they become these chaotic board meetings where everyone's saying everything, nothing's actually getting accomplished. Let's hire a consultant and that'll solve our problem, but it won't. It'll just create a nice document for us, right? To me, the idea of boards embracing values and saying, we are going to create a values committee. And that values committee has periodic meetings, whatever it is, where we determine, adjust, define our focus and our values. We take input, we do that, but at the end of the day, we make decisions. Once those decisions are made, both complaining parents and complaining donors have to conform to what the values committee decides.
Right. So I think that is a higher order task, right? And I think your school needs to have good systems in place. It needs to have good leaders in place, and it needs to have governance and finance and fiduciary responsibilities in place before. And you might think it's the reverse. You might say, let values lead the discussion, but it's very hard to have a values-based discussion when you're firefighting all day long.
Right. Absolutely. I agree with that 100%.
So I do think that, again, not to toot our own horn as an institution, I think we're in a place where we can do that. And I think we are doing a good job at acculturating the students under a specific umbrella, giving out these specific values.
It's an Israeli flag umbrella.
It is. It is. But I do think we can do a better job, and I think everybody would agree that we can do a better job of kind of articulating who we are. But I think the reason why we haven't up to this point is because there's a perception that we have. And I would argue that we haven't done it very well, because you go to 5 different people and ask them, they won't know. But that's like that about a lot of institutions. And I think you need a highly engaged lay leadership committee, you need highly engaged donors, and you need leadership that's willing to make decisions that express those values.
Yeah.
We'll get there. It's easy. We got all the ingredients. That I'm 100% certain. But again, change is hard, right? So people might be upset along the way.
I also think there's another risk in this, which is if you do this and you do it well, you invite competition, which I would say from a systemic perspective is great.
Yeah, I don't really I'm not worried about competition. I'm not worried about.
But I don't think that's the case in general. I think part of the inclination to be everything to everyone is to try and inhibit competition. And I think the Federation is as much at fault for this as any organization because of its umbrella reach and how it tries to sort of do these sort of large cast values over many different schools, right? And it's a pay to play. It's like if you want to be in the system, you have to have this. In a true free market, you would just have everyone defining their slice, and you'd have if you're all about skills, right? And you're going to be the skills school. Then the parents who don't want skills are going to start the happy, clappy, feel-good school, and they'll have that.
I'm honestly not worried about that because I think parents don't understand how expensive it is to start schools.
Right.
So I think that if people want to try to start schools, go ahead. I think that education is really expensive. I think people can look at public schools. I know you wanted to talk about tuition on a different podcast, but people can look at the cost per student for public schools. It's astronomical. Like it is very expensive to teach students, to teach kids. And if people think that they can do a better job delivering education,
great,
go for it.
Right. I agree with that.
But that's like in any business. Like I can't be worried about what everybody else is going to do. Right. I can only be worried about what I'm doing and what we can be good at. Right. And whatever happens, that's fine as long as we're crushing it ourselves.
Okay. Awesome.
Okay.
Thanks for this. This was great. Bye.